They outnumbered us 100 to 1, so we brought 100 schemes. The sky above Earth's deep space station was never truly dark anymore. For 300 years, humanity had looked up at the stars and dreamed of neighbors. They had sent probes, signals, songs, and prayers into the void. They had hoped for something kind to answer back. What answered back was the Vrakti. Commander Junho stood at the wide observation window of ISV Persistence and looked at the enemy fleet. He did not blink. He did not speak. He just stood there, with his hands behind his back, and counted. He counted until the numbers stopped making sense. 4,000 warships, each one 3 times the size of Earth's largest vessel. They hung in space like a wall of steel and fire, and behind them, the stars had disappeared entirely. Junho was not a tall man. He was not the kind of person who filled a room when he walked in. He had a quiet face, short hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that always looked like they were doing math. People who met him for the first time often forgot him quickly. That was something he had always found useful. He turned away from the window. The bridge of ISV Persistence was full of people who were trying very hard not to look afraid. Officers checked screens that did not need checking. Technicians typed things that did not need typing. Everyone was busy doing nothing, because doing nothing meant thinking about the 4,000 ships outside, and nobody wanted to think about that. Lieutenant Daeun was the only one who looked completely calm. She was sitting at the strategy table with a cup of cold coffee and a holographic map open in front of her. She was 29 years old and had the kind of face that made people think she was bored when she was actually thinking very hard. She looked up when Junho approached. "They sent another message," she said. "I know," Junho said. "Play it." The screen on the table flickered, and the face of Admiral Vorath appeared. The Vrakti looked nothing like humans. They were large, gray-skinned, with 4 eyes arranged in a wide circle around a flat face, and mouths that opened sideways instead of up and down. Vorath's voice came through the translator in a deep, grinding tone that sounded like boulders rolling downhill. "You have 1 hour," Vorath said. "Surrender your station, your fleet, and your species' territorial rights to the Vrakthi Empire. Refuse, and we will remove you from this part of the galaxy, the way one removes a splinter. You are 40 ships. We are 4,000. There is no version of this moment where you win. You are not warriors. You are not a threat. You are an inconvenience, and we are giving you the courtesy of a warning because our laws require it. Do not mistake our courtesy for weakness." The message ended. Nobody on the bridge spoke for a moment. Then Junho said, "How long ago did they send that?" 51 minutes ago, Daeun said. "So we have 9 minutes before they expect an answer." "Yes." Junho pulled out a chair and sat down across from Daeun. He looked at the holographic map. It showed the positions of all 4,000 Vrakthi ships, their formation patterns, their known weapons ranges, and the locations of humanity's 40 vessels. The math was not good. The math was, in fact, terrible. Even a child looking at this map would understand immediately that humanity was in serious trouble. Junho did not look at the map like a man in trouble. He looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood, with patience, with interest, and with the quiet confidence of someone who knows what tools he has in his hands. "Bring everyone in," he said. Daeun nodded and touched her earpiece. "All senior staff to the strategy table, now." They came in 1s and 2s. Engineer Hyunwoo arrived first, still wiping grease off his hands from something he had been building in the lower deck. He was a broad-shouldered man with thick glasses and a habit of finishing other people's sentences. Behind him came Nara, the head pilot, small and quick-moving, with the kind of reflexes that made other pilots feel slow. Then Sora, the mission economist, who looked more like a librarian than a soldier, and carried a data pad that never left her hand. Then Inho, the tactical historian, old and white-haired, who walked slowly but never missed anything. And finally, Yuna, the ship's chief medical officer, who had published 3 papers on alien psychology, and once convinced a hostile species to stand down by sending them a very specific type of music. They gathered around the table. They looked at the map. They looked at Juno. 9 minutes, Juno said simply. To do what? Hyunwoo asked. To decide what we're going to tell them. I think the answer is obvious, Nara said, crossing her arms. We stall. Agreed, said Sora. Every minute we keep them talking is a minute they're not shooting. Inho leaned over the map, his old eyes scanning slowly. The Vrakthi have never lost a war by direct combat, he said. In 400 years of expansion, every species they faced either surrendered or was destroyed. They have no framework for a third option. Then we give them a third option, Juno said. The table was quiet. What exactly are we planning here, Commander? Because I want to be clear about whether this is a desperate last stand or an actual plan. Junho looked at her. It's an actual plan. You have a plan for fighting 4,000 ships with 40? I have 100 plans, he said, and I intend to use all of them. Nobody laughed. They looked at his face and understood that he was not joking. There was something in the way Junho said things, quietly, without decoration, that made people believe him even when what he said was almost impossible. Daeun had worked with him for 6 years and had seen this face before. It was the face he made when he had already thought 10 steps further than everyone else in the room. She opened a new file on her datapad. Then we should start. We already started, Junho said. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small folded piece of paper on the table. Paper was unusual on a starship. He unfolded it slowly. It was covered in small, neat handwriting. Numbers, names, symbols, arrows. This is the outline, he said. I wrote it 6 months ago, when we first picked up Vrakthi long-range scout signals, moving toward this sector. I knew they were coming. I knew what they would say when they arrived. And I knew we would have approximately 1 hour to respond. Daeun stared at the paper. 6 months ago? 6 months ago, he confirmed. Outside the window, 4,000 warships waited. Inside the bridge, 7 humans leaned over a piece of paper and began to work. The hour was almost up. But for Junho, the real clock had started 6 months ago, and humanity was already far ahead. The first thing Junho did was send a reply to Admiral Vorath. It was not a surrender. It was not a challenge either. It was a single sentence, politely worded, translated carefully into Vrakthi formal speech. We are deliberating, as is our cultural right, under the Galactic Compact of Rational Engagement, Article 9, Subsection 4. We request an extension of 6 hours. The Galactic Compact was an old document, written long before humanity had joined the wider galactic community. Most species used it only in ceremony. But Article 9, Subsection 4 was real, and it was binding. And it said very clearly that any species under a first contact ultimatum had the legal right to a deliberation period before responding. The Vrakthi, as a signing member of the compact, could not legally fire a single shot during that window without violating agreements that affected their trade relationships with 11 other species. Vorath's response came back in 4 minutes. It was 2 words, 6 hours. Daeun marked the time on her pad. Scheme 1 complete. Junho nodded and moved immediately to the next line on his paper. Hyunwoo had already gone back to the lower deck before Junho finished speaking. He had a team of 12 engineers down there, and they had been working on something for the past 3 months that looked, from the outside, like routine maintenance equipment. It was not maintenance equipment. It was a signal array, not for communication, but for something far more specific. Hyunwoo had spent a long time studying Vrakthi fleet architecture, and he had noticed one particular detail that most people had overlooked. The Vrakthi command structure was perfectly centralized. Every decision passed through the flagship. Every order came from Vorath. Every piece of information in the fleet was filtered through a single command network. It was an efficient system, fast, clean, organized. It was also a system with one enormous weakness, which was that it depended entirely on the assumption that the information flowing through it was accurate. Hyunwoo's array began broadcasting at 0214 hours. It did not broadcast weapons fire. It broadcast distress signals, 200 of them, all at once, all using stolen Vrakthi scout ship frequency codes that humanity had quietly collected over the past 4 years, from derelict vessels that had drifted into human-monitored space. Each signal was slightly different. Each one sent the same basic message. A scout ship was under attack by an unknown aggressor. The Vrakthi fleet responded exactly as their protocols demanded. 34 ships peeled away from the main formation and moved outward to investigate. They found nothing at any of the 200 locations because there was nothing to find. But finding nothing took time. And while those 34 ships wandered in the dark looking for a threat that did not exist, they were no longer pointing their weapons at Earth's station. 34 ships neutralized without firing a single round, Nara said, watching the movement on the map with something close to admiration. That's beautiful. Don't get comfortable, Junho said. We have 99 more things to do. Sora was already on her third communication. She was talking to people the Vrakthi did not know humanity knew. Representatives of the Merath Merchant Collective, a neutral trading guild that operated across 14 systems and maintained careful relationships with every major power in the region, including the Vrakthi. Sora had been building a relationship with the collective's human liaison for 2 years. She had shared trade data, offered favorable exchange terms, and been, by all accounts, a very pleasant contact. She was now calling in every favor at once. The Vrakthi fleet, currently sitting in this sector, contains 17 supply vessels that are formally registered as Merath contracted carriers, she explained quietly into her comm. If those vessels participate in an unprovoked military action, it violates the collective's neutrality charter. I am formally requesting that the collective issue an immediate compliance order, requiring those vessels to withdraw pending legal review. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the liaison said, "That's a very specific request." "I've been planning it for a while," Sora said. The compliance orders went out within 40 minutes. The 17 supply ships bound by contract to the Merath Collective broadcast their withdrawal notices and moved out of the combat zone. They did not do it happily. Their captains were furious. But they did it because the collective's legal team confirmed that Sora was entirely correct, and violating the neutrality charter would cost them far more than one battle. Vorath lost 17 supply ships to paperwork. Daeun was keeping a running count on her pad. Schemes 2 through 14 complete. We've neutralized 51 ships so far, and we haven't been in the 6-hour window for even 2 hours. Inho was sitting at the far end of the table reading a very old book. He looked up. The Vrakthi will notice the supply ships withdrawing. Yes, Juno said. They'll assume it's a technical issue at first, then they'll investigate. When they realize it's legal action, Vorath will be angry. Yes, Junho said again. And an angry Vorath is predictable, Junho finished. An angry Vorath makes faster decisions. Faster decisions mean less careful thinking. Less careful thinking is exactly what we need. Inho smiled slowly and went back to his book. Yuna came in from the medical bay with 2 cups of actual hot coffee, which was rare enough on a deep space posting that Junho accepted it without question. She sat down next to him and looked at the paper on the table. Her eyes moved across the handwriting slowly. You wrote 100 schemes, she said. Yes. And you've been carrying this paper for 6 months? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Did you ever think we wouldn't need it? That maybe the Vrockthi would choose a different sector, or decide humans weren't worth the effort? Junho wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. No, he said. I knew they were coming. The scout signals were too focused, too consistent. They had been mapping this sector for a long time. And when I read the historical records of every species the Vrockthi had absorbed, every single one, I noticed that none of them had been warned. The Vrockthi gave us a warning because we are the first species they have encountered who scared them slightly. Yuna looked up. We scared them? Our expansion rate, he said simply. In 300 years, humans went from a single planet to 47 systems. No species has ever moved that fast. The Vrockthi looked at that number and decided to come before we got too large to swallow. The warning was not courtesy. It was caution. The bridge was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Vrockthi fleet was still enormous, still overwhelming, still terrifying in every way that a wall of 4,000 warships could be terrifying. But somewhere in that fleet, 34 ships were chasing ghost signals. 17 supply vessels were filing withdrawal paperwork. Vorath was reading an unexpected legal notice with 4 eyes that were certainly not happy. And in a small room on a small ship, 7 humans were 3 hours into a 6-hour window, working through a handwritten list of 100 ideas. Next scheme, Daeon said, looking at the paper. Junho picked it up. His finger moved down the list. This one, he said, is Nara's turn. Nara set down her coffee and cracked her knuckles. She had been waiting for her name to come up. What do I get to do? Junho turned the paper so she could read it. Her expression shifted from calm to something that might have been delight. Oh, she said, that's going to make them very confused. That's the idea, Junho said. The clock moved, the schemes continued, and humanity, 40 ships against 4,000, kept quietly winning battles that the enemy didn't know were being fought. They outnumbered us 100 to 1, so we brought 100 schemes. Nara's job was to be confusing on purpose, and she was very good at it. She took the controls of 4 of humanity's smallest vessels, fast, light scout ships with almost no weapons but very good engines, and she flew them directly toward the Vrockthi fleet. Not fast, not aggressive, just a slow, calm drift, moving toward the enemy like someone walking into a room they weren't invited to, without quite enough speed to look threatening, and without quite enough hesitation to look scared. The Vrockthi fleet immediately raised weapons. Nara kept flying. Then, at a specific distance, close enough that the Vrockthi targeting systems were locked on, far enough that they hadn't quite fired yet, all 4 ships stopped. They just stopped, floating in space. Then they turned, very slowly, not back toward Earth's station, but sideways. They began flying in a wide, lazy circle. A perfect circle. Slowly, evenly, with no variation. The Vrockthi targeting computers, which were extraordinarily advanced and had successfully analyzed the combat behavior of 63 different species, did not know what to do with this. There was no known species that responded to a weapons lock by flying in a circle. It was not an evasive pattern, it was not an attack vector, it was not a retreat. Their computers ran through every possible explanation and kept arriving at the same result. Inconclusive. Vorath's command team sent 3 separate orders to the targeting systems in 11 minutes, and each time the computers responded with the same word. Inconclusive. While the Vrockthi spent 14 minutes trying to understand why 4 human ships were flying in a perfect circle for no apparent reason, Hyunwoo's team launched the second piece of Scheme 15. 40 small drones, each no larger than a person's fist, slipped out of ISV Persistence's lower bay and moved in the opposite direction from Nara's circle. They spread across the wide empty space behind the Vrakthi fleet, traveling along the edge of the fleet's sensor shadow, the one blind spot that every large fleet has, directly behind itself, where its own mass blocks its own sensors. Each drone carried a simple device, not a weapon, a broadcaster, each one tuned to a very specific frequency, the same frequency the Vrakthi used for internal fleet-to-fleet communication between junior officers. At Hyunwoo's signal, all 40 drones began broadcasting at once. What they broadcast was noise, but not random noise. Hyunwoo had spent 3 months analyzing captured Vrakthi communication patterns and had found something interesting. The Vrakthi used a rhythmic encoding system that embedded urgency signals inside ordinary communication tones. A certain rhythm meant routine. A faster rhythm meant alert. And a very specific broken rhythm, irregular, stuttering, half-formed, meant something the translation notes described as closest to the human concept of something is very wrong, but I don't know what. All 40 drones broadcast that broken rhythm at 40 different points around the rear of the fleet, simultaneously. The effect was immediate and deeply unpleasant for Vrakthi junior officers. Every ship in the fleet's rear section began receiving what their training told them was a network-wide distress signal coming from inside their own formation. Officers began querying each other. Ships began running internal checks. Damage control teams activated in vessels that had taken no damage. 3 ships in the rear line actually began moving away from their own fleetmates, instinctively trying to clear space from what their sensors told them was a possible internal threat. Vorat's command ship sent out a fleet-wide clarification order 8 minutes later. By then, the disruption had cost the rear formation its coherent positioning. Ships that had moved were slow to return to line because nobody wanted to be the officer who repositioned incorrectly in front of the admiral. Schemes 15 through 22 complete, Daeun said, updating her count. She had stopped sounding surprised and now just sounded focused. We've effectively neutralized over 130 ships so far, through signals, legal action, and 4 ships flying in a circle. The circle is still going, Nara said from across the room. She was watching the feed from the scout ships with the expression of someone watching a particularly good piece of theater. They still haven't fired. They're just watching. They don't like firing at things they don't understand, Inho said, without looking up from his book. The Vrakthi are confident, not reckless. They prefer full information before committing a weapons response. It served them very well against rational opponents. Lucky for us we're not fully rational, Hyunwoo said. Lucky for us, Inho agreed pleasantly. Junho was on the other side of the bridge, talking quietly into a comm channel that was routed through 6 different relay points before reaching its destination. He was talking to a man named Dohun, who was not on any ship in the current engagement. Dohun was several systems away, sitting in a very ordinary office in a very ordinary building on a human colony called Cetera Station. Dohun looked, to all appearances, like a mid-level logistics administrator, which was what his official records said he was. He was not a mid-level logistics administrator. He was the person Junho had trusted with Scheme 31 through Scheme 40, which had been running quietly in the background for the past 4 months, and had nothing to do with signals, drones, or circles. How are the accounts? Junho asked. Fully transferred, Dohun said. The 3rd relay completed 2 days ago. They won't find the origin point for at least 6 weeks. And the contacts? In position, all 9. They've been in Vrakthi space for months. They know what to do when you send the signal. Good, Junho said. Wait for my word. He closed the channel and came back to the strategy table. Everyone looked at him. What was that? Sora asked. Insurance, he said. Yuna looked at the handwritten paper on the table. How many of these schemes involve things that are already in motion that we don't know about? Junho considered the question. About 40 of them, he said. There was a pause. You planned 40 schemes in advance that you didn't tell anyone about? Hyunwoo said. I told the people who needed to know, Junho said. Everyone else knowing would have been unnecessary, and would have increased the chance of the information reaching the wrong ears. The Vrakthi have very good intelligence networks. They have been watching this sector for a long time. Nara leaned back in her seat. So when you said 6 months ago you knew they were coming? I began preparing 6 months ago, Junho said. Some of the groundwork goes back further, 2 years in some cases. The room was quiet in a different way now. Not the quiet of fear, but the quiet of people recalculating everything they thought they knew about their commander. Dayan was watching him with an expression that was hard to read, something between deep respect and the mild annoyance of someone who realizes they have been slightly kept in the dark. The circle ships, she said. Nara can bring them back now. They've done their job. Leave them a little longer, Junho said. Vorath is paying attention to them. I want him still paying attention to them when Scheme 23 begins. Which is? Nara asked. Junho looked at Yuna. That one's yours. Yuna blinked. She set down her coffee. Already? The timing is right, Junho said. The fleet's rear formation is disrupted. Their command staff is irritated. Their targeting systems are still processing Nara's circle. This is the correct moment for something that hits them from a completely different direction. Yuna stood up slowly. She picked up her datapad. All right, she said. She walked toward the communications bay. Then she paused and looked back. For what it's worth, she said, I think you might be the strangest person I've ever worked with. Junho said nothing. I mean that as a compliment, she added, and kept walking. The schemes continued. Outside, the Vrakthi fleet was still enormous, still bristling with weapons, still technically capable of ending this with a single coordinated volley. But coordinated required coordination, and coordination required information, and information required systems that were increasingly being interrupted, misdirected, confused, and quietly dismantled from the outside by people the Vrakthi had dismissed as an inconvenience. Vorath had called them a splinter. Splinters, Junho had always thought, were underestimated. They were small, they were easy to ignore, and if you left them alone long enough, they got under your skin and caused far more trouble than their size suggested. He picked up his coffee and looked out at the stars. 3 to go. And they were barely halfway through the list. They outnumbered us 100 to 1. So we brought 100 schemes. Yuda's contribution was not a weapon, a drone, or a signal. It was a question. She had spent most of her career studying how different species thought and felt, what things frightened them, what things confused them, and what things made them pause when they should have kept moving. She had written long papers about it. Most people in the military had not read them. Junho had read all of them, twice, and had flagged specific paragraphs with small sticky notes. The Vrakthi, she had written in one of those papers, were a species defined by certainty. They were large, powerful, successful, and had been winning for so long that they had built their entire identity on the assumption that they would keep winning. They did not handle uncertainty well, not because they were weak, but because they had so rarely been forced to deal with it. What Yuna broadcast on an open, unencrypted channel was a recorded conversation. Not a threatening one, not a tactical one. It was a conversation between two human philosophers, recorded 3 years ago in a university seminar room, discussing a single question. Were the soldiers of an empire morally responsible for the actions of that empire if they were simply following orders and had never been given the choice to do otherwise? It was a real conversation. The two philosophers argued both sides carefully and honestly. They talked about guilt, agency, inheritance, and choice. They used no Vrakthi-specific language. They mentioned no names. But the conversation was translated into Vrakthi and broadcast at a frequency that reached every ship in the fleet, and it was addressed, in the header, to the crews of the Vrakthi expansion fleet, forwarded with respect. The Vrakthi did not have a strong philosophical tradition. Their culture was built around hierarchy, capability, and result. But within the fleet, there were 3 species serving as allied crew members, species that the Vrakthi had absorbed early in their expansion and integrated into their military structure. 2 of those species had deep spiritual traditions. One of them had an entire religious framework built around the concept of personal moral responsibility. By the time Vorath's command staff realized the broadcast was happening and cut it from the internal network, it had been playing for 22 minutes. In 22 minutes, it had reached every ship. In 22 minutes, crew members from those 2 spiritually minded species had heard a conversation that would take considerably longer than 22 minutes to stop thinking about. Reports came back to Vorath's flag bridge over the next 40 minutes. Small incidents. A duty crew on one ship requesting a delay in their shift rotation to hold a brief discussion. Officers on 2 other ships reporting that Allied crew members were asking questions that were technically allowed under fleet conduct rules, but that the officers had no idea how to answer. One ship, a mid-sized weapons platform, reported that its Allied crew contingent had formally submitted a collective conscience query to the ship's captain, which was an obscure but legitimate process by which crew members with spiritual objections could request clarification before participating in an action. Under Vrakthi fleet law, a collective conscience query had to receive a formal response before the ship could execute a fire order. Writing a formal response took time. Dayun tracked the ship in question and marked it on the map. Then she marked 4 others that sent similar queries over the next 30 minutes. 5 ships paused by paperwork and philosophy. "I never thought I'd say those words in a tactical report," Junho said. "Add them to the count," he said. Running total is now 194 ships effectively removed from coordinated engagement capacity, she said. "Nearly 200, Hyunwoo said from the engineering console, out of 4,000. 5%, Nara said. "Is that enough?" "It's not about the percentage," Junho said. "It's about where we remove them from. Vorath's command structure works like a bridge. Remove the right pieces from the right spots, and the whole thing becomes unstable, even if most of the material is still there." He pointed at the map. "The 34 ships chasing ghost signals are all from his forward left flank. The 17 supply ships that withdrew are the primary fuel chain for his center formation. The rear disruption from the drones created a positioning gap between his 3rd and 4th lines. None of these things are catastrophic on their own." He paused and let the silence do its work. "But they're all happening at the same time," Sora said slowly. "And he doesn't know they're connected." "As far as Vorath knows," Juno said, "he is dealing with 5 separate problems. A signal anomaly, a legal dispute with the Merath Collective, an internal fleet communication disturbance, 4 ships flying in a circle, and a philosophical broadcast. Each one looks like a different kind of problem. None of them look like one plan." Inho set down his book and folded his hands. "The Vrakti have a concept in their military doctrine," he said. "It translates roughly as the noise of small things. It refers to minor incidents that happen during a battle which commanders must not allow to distract them from the main objective. Their training specifically teaches officers to ignore the noise of small things. And we're giving them so much noise," Yuna said, coming back into the room, "that they can't tell what's noise and what's the actual threat." "Exactly," Juno said. He sent the signal to Dohun. Dohun, several systems away in his ordinary-looking office, opened a very specific channel and passed a message to 9 people in 9 different locations inside Vrakthi-controlled space. These were people of various species who had, over the past 2 years, been quietly and carefully cultivated as information sources, and, when necessary, as quiet influencers within Vrakthi supply and logistics networks. Maintenance scheduling, parts distribution records. Over the next 90 minutes, Each of these 9 people made a small number of very ordinary-looking adjustments to very ordinary-looking records. A fuel allocation that moved a shipment to the wrong processing queue. A maintenance flag that incorrectly marked 6 ships' propulsion systems as requiring inspection before flight clearance. A parts distribution error that sent the wrong component to the wrong storage bay, generating an automatic hold on those vessels until the discrepancy was resolved. None of these actions looked like sabotage. All of them were explainable as administrative errors, the kind that happened in large organizations every single day. All of them required time to resolve, and all of them, together, quietly grounded or slowed down an additional 41 ships without a single shot fired. Vorath, by this point, was beginning to understand that something was wrong, not with any specific thing, but with the general shape of the situation. Too many small problems were arriving at once. His staff was stretched thin managing responses to issues that individually required attention, but that together were preventing him from organizing a clean, confident strike. He sent a message to Junho. It was short. It said, "What are you doing?" Junho read it twice. He handed it to Dan. She read it, and the corner of her mouth moved. He dictated his response carefully. "We are deliberating, as stated. We remain committed to a peaceful resolution, and appreciate your patience." It contained language that the translator flagged as profanity in 4 dialects. Junho filed it without responding. 2 hours and 40 minutes remained in the window. The team had completed 67 schemes. Outside, the Vrakthi fleet still looked like an overwhelming force. Still 4,000 ships, minus the ones who had wandered off or been legally extracted. Still enough firepower to end this conversation in minutes if Vorath decided to stop caring about the Galactic Compact and simply fire. That was still a very real possibility. Junho knew it. Everyone on the bridge knew it. The weight of it sat at the edges of every conversation, in the pauses between updates, in the way people kept glancing at the observation window. He could still just fire, Nara said, saying the thing nobody else was saying. "Yes," Junho said. "The compact has penalties, but they're financial, not military." He could absorb them, yes. So what stops him? Junho was quiet for a moment. He looked at the map, at the shape of the fleet, at the gaps and the disruptions, and the 200 ships that were no longer fully in the fight. "Right now," he said, "he doesn't know how many schemes we have. He knows something is happening. He doesn't know if it's 10 things or 100 things. He doesn't know if firing is walking into a trap or ending a trap. That uncertainty is what stops him. Not morality, not law, uncertainty." He picked up his paper and looked at Scheme 68. "So we make him more uncertain," he said. "They outnumbered us 100 to 1, so we brought 100 schemes." With 1 hour left in the window, Vorath made a decision. He had spent 4 hours watching small, strange, frustrating things happen to his fleet. Ships chasing ghosts, supply vessels filing paperwork, crew members asking philosophical questions, communication systems behaving strangely, administrative holds appearing on vessels for reasons that each made individual sense, but that together made no sense at all. His staff was exhausted. His forward formation had a gap in the left flank. His rear lines were still slightly out of position. He had lost the clean, organized picture of his fleet that he had arrived with, and he could not fully get it back. He was not a foolish man. He knew that he was being played. He did not know how, or by how many moving parts, or where the next piece would come from. And that not knowing had been grinding at him for 4 hours, in a way that 4,000 warships were not supposed to be ground at by 40. He made the decision that his training and his ego and his 400 years of institutional success told him was the correct one. He ordered a direct charge. Not a probing strike, not a targeted response. A full charge, all available ships, directly at humanity's 40 vessels. Not because it was subtle, because subtlety had, for the first time in a very long career, stopped working, and Vorath was done being subtle. The order went out to the fleet. The response was not quite what he expected. 231 ships moved. The rest hesitated. Not because they refused, but because the fleet's formation was broken in too many places. Too many vessels were mid-process on the administrative holds, and the maintenance flags, and the communication queries, and the legal withdrawal procedures. And a fleet in motion requires coordination the way a body requires bones. Without the structure in place first, movement becomes stumbling. The 231 ships that did move did so without their flanking support, without their fuel chain ships in correct position, without their rear lines properly aligned, and critically, without the 53 vessels that had moved in various directions over the past 4 hours and had not yet returned to their assigned grid positions. They moved into a corridor of space that Junho had been quietly pointing them toward for the past 2 hours. Hyunwoo's gravity pulse mines were not spectacular. They did not explode. They bent local space-time in a very small but very specific way that was enormously disorienting to anything moving at speed inside it. Hyunwoo had designed them to be exactly powerful enough to make a pilot feel, for approximately 30 to 40 seconds, as if the ship had rolled completely upside down. Instruments would confirm normal orientation. The pilot's body would insist otherwise. 30 seconds of physical disorientation at attack speed in a formation of 231 ships that was already not properly aligned produced exactly the result that any engineer with a working understanding of physics and a dark sense of humor might predict. Ships corrected in wrong directions. Vessels that had been 300 meters apart closed to 30. Collision avoidance systems fired maneuvering thrusters in emergency patterns that sent ships sideways into the paths of other ships. In the span of 4 minutes, 62 Vrokvi ships had collided with each other. Not catastrophically, not destroyed, but damaged. Propulsion systems offline. Hull alerts triggered. Automatic safety protocols engaging, pulling those vessels out of attack posture and into damage control mode. The charge dissolved before it reached humanity's line. The bridge of ISV persistence was very quiet. Nara, who had seen a great many things in her career as a pilot, was staring at the sensor readout with an expression that suggested she was not quite able to process what she was looking at. Hyunwoo had both hands over his face and appeared to be laughing silently into his palms. Sora was updating numbers on her pad. Inho had closed his book. Daeon spoke first. 312 ships now outside coordinated combat effectiveness, she said. Her voice was completely steady, as if she were reading a grocery list. Vorath's effective strike force is now approximately 9% of what he arrived with. Still enough to destroy us, Nara said, because she was a pilot and pilots counted available firepower the way some people counted exits in a room. Yes, Juno said, still enough. He was standing at the window again. He did this when he was thinking, stood at the window and looked at the problem from the outside. The fleet was visibly in disarray. Ships scattered, some drifting, small repair craft moving between hulls, the clean geometry of the original formation now looking ragged and irregular. It was nothing like the wall of steel that had greeted them 6 hours ago. But Nara was right. What remained was still capable of enormous damage. And Vorath was now angry in a way that was past caution, past patience, past the careful calculations that had kept him from firing in the first hour. Junho turned away from the window and looked at the paper on the table. Scheme 100. Everyone in the room looked at him. He had been building to this for 6 hours, for 6 months, for 2 years, if the groundwork was properly counted. They had dismantled a fleet with ghosts and paperwork and circles and philosophy and tiny invisible minds and 9 accountants in the wrong jobs. They had done everything the paper said. And now there was one line left. He picked up the comm and opened a channel directly to Vorath's flagship. not routed through automated systems, not translated by committee. A direct channel, voice only, commander to admiral. Vorath answered immediately. The admiral's face appeared on a screen, 4 eyes, and all of them hard with anger. But underneath the anger was something else. Something that Yuna, watching from across the room, recognized from her papers. It was the specific expression of a person who has just realized, not that they are losing, but that they do not fully understand what is happening to them, and that not understanding frightens them more than losing would. Enough, Vorath said. Agreed, Junho said. A pause. You have done something, Vorath said. The translator struggled slightly with the next phrase. Something that I do not have a word for, in our language. What you have done does not have a word in our language. I'm not surprised, Junho said. We had to invent most of it ourselves. Vorath was quiet for a long moment. The silence on the channel had a different texture than the silences earlier. Those had been the silences of a powerful person tolerating something lesser. This was the silence of a person thinking. What do you want? Vorath said finally. Not your defeat of me. What is the thing you actually want from this encounter? Junho glanced at Daeyun. She gave him a very small nod. The same thing we wanted before you arrived, Junho said. To exist, to grow, to explore. We want to not be removed from this part of the galaxy. We want to be left alone to do what we do. And in exchange, he paused, we are willing to offer something the Vrakthi Empire has never been offered before. Vorath's 4 eyes narrowed slightly. What? A genuine, detailed account of everything we did in the last 6 hours, Junho said. Every scheme, every method, every contact, every system, every technique, freely shared, openly documented. Because the species that can do what we just did to your fleet without firing a shot is not a species you want as an enemy, but it might be a very useful species to have as something else. Another long silence. On the strategy table, Daeyun had her stylus poised over her pad. Hyunwoo had lowered his hands from his face. Nara was not looking at her instruments. Sora, Inho, and Yuna were all still, all watching the screen. Juno had written Scheme 106 months ago, on the same piece of paper, in the same small, neat handwriting. It said give him a reason to choose something other than war. Make the alternative more interesting than the victory. You would share this freely, Vorath said. With us, the force that came here to absorb you? We would share it with whoever sits across from us at a table, Juno said. The Vrakthi sitting across from us is you, so yes, with you. Vorath looked at him for a very long time. Then he said, send me the location of this table. The bridge of ISV Persistence did not erupt in cheering. That was not the kind of crew they were, and it was not the kind of moment that called for it. What happened was quieter, and in its own way, more satisfying. Daeyun wrote a final number on her pad and set it down. Hyunwoo exhaled very slowly. Nara leaned back in her seat and looked at the ceiling. Sora was already composing a message to the Marath Collective Liaison. Inho opened his book again, found his page, and kept reading. Yuna sat very still for a moment, and then smiled at no one in particular. Junho folded the paper carefully, the same way he had folded it 6 months ago, and put it back in his jacket pocket. The peace talks took 11 months. They were difficult, frequently frustrating, and required 3 separate teams of negotiators working in rotation because no single team could sustain the pace. The Vrakthi were not naturally inclined to partnership, and many of their officers remained angry about the events of that single 6-hour window for a long time afterward. But they sat at the table, and they kept sitting at it. Daeyun was asked, later, by a journalist writing about the event, what she thought the most important moment of the whole encounter had been. She thought about it for a while. There was a moment, she said, very early, in the first hour, when the commander put a piece of paper on the table. A handwritten piece of paper, with 100 things written on it. And I looked at it, and I realized that he had been planning this before any of us knew there was anything to plan for. He wasn't reacting. He had been building. For 2 years. The journalist asked, "And that gave you confidence?" Daeun thought about it again. "It gave me something better than confidence," she said. "I wanted to see what a person like that had written on that piece of paper." She paused. All 100 of them turned out to be worth reading. Junho, when asked the same question, was considerably more brief. He said that the most important moment was the one where Vorath had asked, "What do you actually want?" Because that was the first moment the Admiral had stopped thinking about winning and started thinking about the situation. And a person who is thinking about the situation can be reasoned with in ways that a person thinking about winning cannot. He was also asked if he had ever doubted the plan. He said no. He was asked if he had been afraid. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was afraid the whole time. That's why I wrote 100 schemes instead of 10. Fear is useful if you put it to work." He was asked one last question, the one every journalist saved for the end. What would he have done if Vorath had simply fired in the first hour, before any of the schemes could take effect? Junho smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and private, the smile of a man keeping exactly one secret. "I had a scheme for that too," he said. He did not say what it was,